So hi, and thank you everyone for coming along tonight. I'm Rory Waterman, a member of the English and Creative Writing academic staff at Nottingham Trent University and the convener of Nottingham Creative Writing Hub at NTU. And this is a Nottingham Creative Writing Hub event funded by Nottingham Trent University and free for all to attend. Nottingham Creative Writing Hub is the central place for creative writing at Nottingham Trent, hosted by the Department of English, Philosophy and Communications. And NTU is home to dynamic and long-established undergraduate and postgraduate courses in creative writing at BA, MA and PhD, with an exciting, thriving, diverse community of writers writing across all genres. If you go to our website, and I'll put a link in the chat shortly, you'll find links to our courses, member profiles, a blog, and information about events past and forthcoming, among other things. Before long, there'll also be videos and audio from many of our previous events as well, so look out for that. A little bit of housekeeping before I pass over to the event chair. Those of you in the audience will be able to see and hear the readers throughout the evening, of course, but audience members, you can't be seen or heard yourselves. So if you're doing yoga poses or something, we can't see that, but enjoy yourselves. All of you in the audience are invited to ask questions and make comments. There's a chat function for comments. You'll see that at the bottom of the screen. You might have to hover your cursor over it, but you'll see that at the bottom of the screen. And down there as well, you'll see a Q&A button. And that's where you can submit questions. Click the Q&A button and you can submit your questions there. And you can submit those for any of our panelists, any of our readers, and you can do so at any point throughout the event. And now I'll get out of the way and I'll pass to our event chair, my colleague and friend, Jenni Ramone. Over to you, Jenni.
Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Jenni Ramone. I work with Rory at NTU and I direct the Postcolonial Studies Centre with another of our colleagues. I'm really happy to have been invited to chair this evening's event with three wonderful speakers. If you have any questions for the speakers tonight, please add them to the Q&A at any point, and I'll try to pose as many of your questions to the speakers as I can. We'll begin tonight with Lauren Morey. Lauren Morey is a BA Creative Writing student at NTU. She tends to write about the subject of mental health and other difficult topics, and she's currently working on a digital poem which has the working title Lockdown. And she's publishing it on different social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram, which sounds fascinating. I've really enjoyed teaching Lauren this year on my modules, Literary Cultures and Black Writing in Britain, where I've noticed her keen eye for detail and structure. Tonight, Lauren Morey will be reading a prose piece with the theme of lockdown entitled Entrapment. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. I shall begin. I have come to know this room of mine rather well over the course of this entrapment. I have noticed the thin layer of dust over my shelves and the way the morning light glares on this imperfection. The four walls that imprison me have made their way closer and closer without ever touching. It never used to feel this small. Tracing back my memories, I remember when this room used to feel so big, and now that I have grown, it has become an abandoned shell of my childhood, one which I need to escape. The open spaces, vibrant green grass, and the smiling sun, like that of a cartoon, taunt me with freedom through the square window. I wish I had never taken it for granted. Now I am stuck here, staring at my old posters from my teenage years, of bands I have not listened to since. Or I look to the stuffed toy mountain showcasing the gifts I received time and time again from the ages of 3 to 12. The past I had created staring back at me through glass eyes, a torture of my own creation, good memories turning sour the longer I stare, wishing for my sentence to be up. Most of the time is spent staring up at my ceiling, which is littered with glow-in-the-dark stars that don't glow as bright anymore. I remember when Dad had to bring in the stepladder to help put up the imaginary constellation. Thinking back on the memory, that was when I got this bed, the same bed that seemed too big for a big girl, where now my feet hang over the edge. My youthful torment I cannot escape and have to relive over and over again until the prize of freedom is granted. My prison uniform is as follows: leggings and a t-shirt, and maybe a jumper when the English weather graces us. But we can't have the heating on because it's summer, Mary. I'm not wasting money on heating. I haven't used any of my new wardrobe for choice of convenience and lack of motivation to wear or do anything else. Every time I have the courage to leave, I am met with backhanded comments tearing me down and retreat back to my hovel. When are you going to get your life together? I don't know. Why are you wearing the same thing as yesterday? Because I can. Was it you that ate all the malted milks? Ask Dad. Why don't you do something outside of your room? No, thank you. What I really want to say instead is a lot harsher. For instance, I had my life together before you brought me home against my will, I might add, all because you were scared you wouldn't see me again. Yes, I ate the malted milks, but that's because you ate all the chocolate digestives. I would leave my room if there was more than just sitting and watching Loose Women and Coronation Street reruns. It would also help if you didn't bombard me when I choose to. When the pandemic broke out, a lot of things I valued I had lost and replaced. Living away from home had given me the freedom I needed and a newfound identity. Reversion back to my childhood home out of the goodness of my heart has made the progress falter and rewind. I'd also gotten a great group of friends and work colleagues, making it every day worthwhile. I now have my parents to contend with who regret their begging of me to return, and a blank phone screen with no new notifications. I was very punctual and motivated with everything I did. Instead, my laptop pings with missed Zoom calls, and I continue to have Netflix on the run whilst I mindlessly scroll through social media. My own coping strategy of isolation. After a wide berth away, it is painful being crammed back into your childhood shell. It becomes more difficult to escape it a second time. I am forced to endure my pink fairy wallpapered walls, which have tweenies and thimble stickers above the headboard. I had grown out of all this years ago, but it's as though my parents had never received the memo and have kept the room just how it used to be, as though it is a museum exhibition. The only difference is me, Mary. I am 20 soon, and they still treat me like I am a kid in their eyes. Never consider an adult. There's a phrase for this: rose-tinted glasses, but for the past rather than the good. The hours feel like days, and the longer I stare at walls, no sign to show that it will end. Instead, the newsreels keep showing extension after extension, rather than the freedom they promised months ago. Turning my painted smile into a deeper frown, one where if the wind changed, it would stay like that. Not that it is necessary at this rate. The cases, along with deaths, are rising, but there is no use at scaring the idiots into thinking they're in danger if it doesn't affect them too. No point telling them what to do with no reprimand if these rules aren't followed, because the public is filled with selfishness rather than selflessness. Since they would rather let me and the rest of those at risk stay indoors with no hope of freedom as long as it benefits them, shrinking more and more into the childhood prison, being swallowed by the Hannah Montana bedspread, looking up at the fading imaginary constellation as the days and nights blur into one. I can just about hear my mother shouting, "Dinner's ready," and imagine my younger self running in from a stuffed toy tea party with a gap-toothed smile on my face. I wish for the simpler times, even now, knowing that they will never come, accepting my freedom is lost from the worldwide pandemic.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Remember, if you have any questions for Lauren, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the final part of tonight's event. Our second speaker is Panya Banjoko. Panya Banjoko is a British poet, archivist and PhD researcher in Arts and Humanities at Nottingham Trent University with a Vice-Chancellor awarded scholarship. She's writing a critical creative PhD rooted in Nottingham Black Archive, the archive she founded in 2009. Her debut collection of poetry, Some Things, was published by Burning Eye Press in 2018. Panya is very well known locally for both her poetry and her research and archival work, having performed her poetry extensively recently in support of Bernardine Evaristo, who you may well have heard of. And she's also worked with Nottingham UNESCO City of Literature quite extensively too. She's also the subject of a short biographical film available to watch on YouTube. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce her this evening and to have the opportunity to hear some of her poetry again. Please welcome Panya Banjoko.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I'm always, So good evening, my name is Panya Banjoko and I'm going to share with you 2, maybe 3 poems if I have time. My PhD, just to give you a little bit of a background, is looking at Black political poetry published in Nottingham during the 1970s and 1980s. And to mine this history, I'm having to interview people and get out there in the field. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. It's also quite emotional. So the first poem I'm going to share with you is a journey of going to visit one of the elders, as I call them, to talk about or ask for information about Black history here in Nottingham. And this one is called When No Mountain is Too Tall. I am 10 minutes late when I arrive, dry-mouthed and trembling, my hands fumbling to ring his bell. I take a moment to cut and clear the air with my confession of the declivitous trail that has challenged my nerves. I settle, press record. He begins. We met in people's homes, squashed back to back in rotting houses, crowded around paraffin lamps. We were comrades from many islands. We dragged our worn out thoughts and plans deep into the night, comforted by white rum. We wanted better for our daughters and our sons, and we've been clearing the dust ever since. He seeks out my endorsement. I nod and use my eyes to urge him to continue. He talks more. I listen to him storm, how he trained to work down the pit that later rejected him, how he was overshot for a kid that could barely blow his nose. Halfway through feeding me history, he leans forward as though he is about to inspect my ear and whispers, I have a box upstairs. I capture his footsteps on the laminate floor, his feet padding up the carpeted stairs, the muffled voice of his wife, and his return to the squeaking armchair. Inside the scuffed box are sheets of foolscap paper, which he thumbs before telling me of their worth. I wish I could have been there when the first battalion of pioneers had arrived in the city, still high from war, ready to pluck injustice from its four-poster bed. His hands linger a while above the box. He blesses it before replacing the lid and blesses me as I set myself ready to ascend the savage hill that had almost conquered me. Thank you. I've spent most of today transcribing, actually. It's really quite an immersive process. If I'm not interviewing, I'm transcribing, and if I'm not transcribing, I'm writing up this cultural history. And one of the things I'm becoming ever more aware of is people's memories, what they remember and how they remember things, and how these memories differ from person to person. And so I thought I'd write a poem about remembering. And this is one of the elders that I interviewed just before the pandemic, which was quite timely because now he's really not in a position to be interviewed, which again is showing me how important this research that I'm doing about the Black literary history here in Nottingham is. So this one is called When Brooding Over Time. He sits down, talks to himself for half an hour to see what he can remember, if anything. Sometimes he sits down for a couple of days and tries to remember when he started at the old school. And then he leans back, talks about remembering something different, talks about the problem of remembering. Why exactly did he leave engineering? If only he could remember. He tries to remember a name, tries to write it down. He can't remember why, and scratches his bald head. His office was shared with the caretaker and the cleaners and their rotary disc machines, which harvested dust. He tries to remember the equipment's roar, or did it hum? He's done many things since then, traveled the country with a little bit of money. There was dust. He remembers that. Dust from the equipment of them little kinty why. He can't remember what more he needs to remember. It's hard work. He went into arts administration. He can't remember where. He works hard to remember. He wishes he could put a finger on it, on what it was that made him stand up and feel he might just win. Was it the playwrights he came from, or the poets like him who gave up their time to meet together in each other's homes, to sip books, to plan, to sit, talk and remember? If only he could remember when the fire disappeared. Thank you. I'm imagining you as an audience. And yeah, this is, like I say, quite an immersive experience writing this PhD. I'm now in my third year, so I'm, on the homeward straight, so to speak. I've loved every single minute of it. I've got a wonderful team working with me. Rory Waterman, who you saw earlier, is one of my supervisors, expert poet. So, I'm surrounded by good people. And yeah, this is the last one that I'm going to share with you before handing back over to Jenny. One of the things that comes up in my supervision with my DOS is that I write about everyone else's history, their literary history here in Nottingham, but I'm not actually putting myself in the story. And it's typical woman, isn't it? We never sing our own songs, which is something we really need to start doing. So I wrote this one to kind of put me into history and to position myself as one of the pioneers and one of the first cohort of women who grew dreadlocks, and depending where you were in the world, you could either be arrested, you could be taken by the police and have them cut, or this neck of the woods here, you'd be refused a job for dreadlocks. But now they're fashionable and everybody wears them. So, but we had to tough it out back in the day. So I thought I'd write this, and it's called When the Rasta Woman Tells Her Story. We tried to shake the dust of empire from our feet, mark out our own roots, adjust the grey landscape with red, gold and green tams, replace the history of servitude with our dreams. We filled our bodies with idol food, gifted from the earth, which we thanked for our liberty as we poured libation. And we told our children about the sting of having fathers who placed our heads on blocks, who struck us from their wills, dragged us to churches and emptied our mouths of Nyabingi chants and forced us to sing, Lord, with me abide, and how they washed us in purified water, thinking that would shake the devil out. We gathered Samson's strength and opened our third eye, saw each stalk of our dread as a pledge and as a mark of respect for the ancestors, the Maasai and the Kikuyu warriors and the Orishas of the deep ocean. Our coils of tangled locks were free from a sentence of being manicured. Our matted velvet vines were palm rolled and twisted, and they dared to stand and be counted, dared to build a new identity, for anthropologists to study, so archivists have a tale to catalogue, and granddaughters have a memory to recall about a rebel of a woman who held on to traditions of celebrating life, who nurtured her dreads, so they trailed to her feet, and how she raised them up and carried them over her shoulder with the tenderness of caring for an old friend, and all the while planting seeds for the new generation of naturals to blossom without shedding tears, and how she would sit under the shade of a tree and sing Rasta woman chants and recount how times had changed. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Panya. Thank you for that very kind of evocative, kind of public and private history. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Please feel free to post any questions that you'd like me to ask Panya in the Q&A. And again, we'll get to as many as we can in the final part of tonight's event. And now I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Okechukwu Nzelu. Okechukwu Nzelu is a writer and teacher. In 2015, he was the recipient of a New Writing North Award. In 2020, his debut novel, The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney, won a Betty Trask Award and was shortlisted for the Betty Trask Prize, the Desmond Elliott Prize, and the Polari First Book Prize. He lives in Manchester and he's a lecturer in creative writing at Lancaster University. I was lucky enough to be able to meet Oki and hear his reading a little over a year ago when he visited NTU as the guest speaker for a conference that my students organised as part of their Literary Cultures module. It was such a captivating event, so I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to chair this event tonight. Please join me in welcoming Okechukwu Nzelu to read from his fascinating, acclaimed novel, The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you so much. And thank you also to Panya and to Lauren for such fantastic readings. I really, really enjoyed those. And it's so nice to be back at NTU, even if only virtually. So I'm really, really glad to be invited here. I'm going to read from towards the beginning of my novel, The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney. There's not much of an introduction needed. So I think I'll just dive in. It starts basically with the character Morris, who is the father of Nnenna, and we meet him and Nnenna's mother before we meet Nnenna. So we get a bit of backstory. Morris is an evangelical Christian who is trying to spread the word of God to the community in Cambridge where he lives, having graduated from the university. But he doesn't really like the people he's working with. So yeah, I'll jump in. Morris came from a devout family, prayers at home each morning before school and 2 church services on Sundays. There was nothing in the Bible Morris hadn't already seen and heard many times, but surely even English people, even fair weather sit at the back English Anglicans, should have found it easy to pick a few quotations. Surely everyone knew the kind of thing that was called for. God is love, I am the truth, the way and the life. No one comes to the Father except through blah, blah, blah. But when one Sunday morning in their meeting after the service, Morris had first suggested these words, Joel had spoken up and complained in his plaintive, weedy voice. These quotations had been done to death. The public was hungry for something fresher. Morris's selections from the book of Jeremiah simply weren't current. To Morris's horror, the idea of a public starved of fresh biblical exegesis caught the imagination of the study group like a Pentecostal fire. They raised their eyes heavenwards and dreamed about atheists walking aimlessly around the city, crying out for obscure passages from Deuteronomy and Habakkuk. Morris tried to point out that the Bible had been around for thousands of years, that the God of Abraham and of Isaac was not in the habit of leaking anything never before seen, that the word of God was old, and that it was the evangelist's job to make his message seem new. In Morris's view, their job was almost like that of a magician or a messiah, to reveal the wondrous in the ordinary, to spin gold out of flax, even, he ventured, to turn water into wine. But nobody listened. Joel talked on, eyes sparkled, murmurs of assent spread through the room, and Morris was overruled by a crushing margin. But not today. Not today. Besides, Joel, he said, it isn't very punchy. We want something that gets people's attention right away, something that delivers God's message with a bit more oomph. We almost want slogans, really. Sound bites, if you like. The other members of the group appeared much more susceptible to logic when faced with the looming possibility of public humiliation and, worse, poetry, and they nodded and hummed their assent to Morris's sensible words. Joel huffed and munched on a digestive biscuit with a long-suffering expression on his face. Well then, said Jonathan Tucker, a maths graduate whose strategy in meetings consisted of staying silent for the first 20 minutes, then calmly and evenly saying something deeply stupid. If we're after something attention-grabbing, why don't we go with something a bit more Sturm und Drang? A little fire and brimstone never hurt anyone. What about, he feigned uncertainty, what about, oh, I don't know, Leviticus 18:22? Morris quoted without hesitation, "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination." Yes. Morris sighed. He liked Jonathan. Truth be told, he was the most earnest of the group, more so even than Morris perhaps, who was passionate but unsure. Jonathan's fervour was different. It burned off him constantly like sulphur, and there were days when you could smell it on him from across the room. To Jonathan, they weren't merely students of the Bible or Christians or even evangelicals. They were the latest in a long line of prophets, like Jeremiah, called to teach the way of the Lord to an uninterested world. Unfortunately, Morris often got the sense that Jonathan actually liked the world to be as uninterested as possible. He spoke gently. We're going to cafes, Jonathan. Cafes. And I'm not being funny, but at the end of the day, we are in Cambridge. What are you saying? I'm saying I think we have to be realistic about the kind of people we're likely to come across. I think we ought to lay our beliefs on the line. You shall not lay with a male as with a woman, he said again, for emphasis. Call me old-fashioned, but our beliefs, they're not all of our beliefs. I mean, they're mine, sort of, maybe. But I agree with Morris, said Alistair, a calm and muscular carpenter who had come to the meetings with the hope of lying with Jonathan as he had never lain with anyone else. He found Jonathan's broodiness irresistible, and Jonathan's oddly tight button-down shirts, no tie, top button done up, transported Alistair's mind to somewhere south of Eden. That Jonathan was a raging homophobe was apparently no concern of his. Besides, said Joel, still smarting, shouldn't we come up with something slightly less confrontational? And everyone likes... Absolutely, said Alistair, and I'm with Morris about the likely audience thing too. We can believe what we believe, but aren't we here to spread the good news? If someone's just sitting there enjoying a latte, you can't march up to them and tell them they're going to burn in hell for being a woofter. Not everyone who likes frothy coffee is gay, Alistair, said Jonathan, glancing nervously at his latte. He put on a gruff voice that made Alistair cross his legs, hum and fold his hands in his lap. Jonathan, conspicuous for bringing the newly fashionable takeaway cups of cafe latte to every meeting, huffed again. What are you looking at? He said. You've got foam on your lip, breathed Alistair, gesturing oh so delicately at Jonathan's mouth. Jonathan blushed and wiped it quickly away. Right, said Morris firmly. So, we aren't going to use Leviticus 18:22. And we can't use the poem about the cat, I'm afraid. No, I'm sorry, Joel, don't look at me like that. We can't. So, let's keep thinking. They went back to work, flicking through passages familiar and unfamiliar. Joel glancing resentfully at Jonathan. Alistair glancing longingly at Jonathan. Morris pretending to read, but too resentful and frustrated at all the glancing to see any of the words. Eventually, Alistair spoke up, his finger on a verse in his Bible. He was excited, but cautious, like an archaeologist unearthing a delicate find that still might crumble before it saw the light. I think I found something, he said. What have you got, Alistair? Said Morris, hardly daring to hope. He was almost coming round to the idea of Christopher Smart's poem that Joel had suggested earlier on, when Alistair began to read from his Bible, a much older translation. He had been reading Job. Of course, how had Morris forgotten Job, to whom God had spoken directly in his suffering? Canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of waters may cover thee? Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts, or who hath given understanding to the heart? What could be better? Job was the one whom God, on a whim, had stripped bare of all his luck, of all the contentment that supposedly makes belief easy. Job was the one God had made naked before him, and in return, God had bared himself to the man, as much as he was ever going to bear himself to anyone. He had answered Job with typical indirectness, not with answers, but more questions. Morris was relieved. Finally, they had found a new way to deliver the old message. It felt precisely right. For comic relief, Joel had wanted to include the verse in which God told Job to gird up thy loins now like a man, I will demand of thee and declare thou unto me. But the others decided against this, unsure if people would appreciate the humour and afraid that it might send the wrong message about what they were trying to achieve. Morris beamed at Alistair and shook his hand. You think it'll work? Said Alistair. I think it will, said Morris. In those days, Joni was an ordinary girl, minding her own ordinary business, figuring out her ordinary undergraduate life at Cambridge, and glumly revising an uninspiring translation of an ancient Greek account of the Peloponnesian War. In fact, Joni Maloney, Joan to her supervisors and lecturers, was looking forward to graduating next year and ready to start again in the real world. Most people would say that she was too young to need a fresh start, but Joni wasn't most people. She had been moved ahead 1 year at school, successfully applied to Cambridge a year early, and was having a thoroughly miserable time. Having succeeded at school, almost entirely as a result of incessant parental pressure and total lack of social life, she had opted for a change of pace when she got to university. She put in an only nominal amount of effort at Cambridge and focused her energies on the things that would carry her far in post-university life, enlarging her already impressive collection of linen scarves, being seen wearing oversized sunglasses in attractive locations, and perpetrating a series of extravagant romantic mistakes with men her mother would hate. To wit, second year, Michaelmas term, Roderick Cleaves, alias Hot Rod, Cleavage, Smelly Roderick, the beagle-loving classicist who didn't own a toothbrush and who dumped her via his best friend after 3 weeks of pretending not to see her in the faculty library. Years later, he was the head of an internet security firm. To wit, Cliff Harper, the mathematicians he slept with after a rather starchy formal dinner. They had both had trapped wind, and Cliff, ever the generous lover, gave her 2 STIs. Rebelling turned out to be a little trickier than she'd realised. Too late, Joni began to see that frequent trips to the pharmacist and an inability to cross her legs were not conducive to the hours of serious study that her contemporaries seemed to be putting in. Not for the last time, it occurred to her that she wasn't a serious enough person. And worse than the itching, there was the shame. She couldn't work through it. She couldn't think through it. In the years that followed, she would eventually come to appreciate the irony of the situation. Her conjugation with Cliff had made her forget her verb tables and chuckle about it. But she wasn't laughing now. She was one of the first women ever to be admitted to her college, and she had the feeling she was supposed to fly the flag for academic women everywhere. Instead, she was failing miserably and publicly. Only this afternoon, she had been asked to leave a seminar after half an hour of mumbled, incorrect answers. The professor had calmly but very audibly explained to her that she had misread the reading list, that she had read the wrong texts, that she was unlikely to benefit from the seminar or, by implication, the university, and she was starting to think that he was right. So when 4 Christians walked into a certain cafe on Huntingdon Road, Joni was already at her lowest ebb, wondering where it had all gone wrong. When the men walked in, they found out immediately, apart from Alistair, who tried, unsuccessfully, to stay inconspicuously close to Jonathan. Joni had seen them before, but she had never been this close, and she watched now with a keen but wary fascination. It wasn't Morris, but Jonathan, who first caught her eye, as he nervously tried to pretend that he was an ordinary person in the cafe. He had a theory that it put people at ease to see them ordering coffees, cakes, and biscuits as though they had no agenda and their evangelism was entirely spontaneous. The others in the group disagreed. They all said it made them look and feel as if the agendas which they certainly did have were somehow unsavoury, as if they needed to be hidden. And it was true that 9 times out of 10, when Jonathan approached a stranger over biscotti and began steering the conversation inexorably towards a certain passage in Leviticus, people tended to feel not only bored and confused, but also that they had been cruelly deceived by this nervous-looking man who, only a moment ago, had been contentedly sipping his frothy coffee and minding his own sodding business. It was Jonathan's discontent that Joni noticed. Although she didn't know about Alistair's passing comment regarding the relationship between homosexuality and frothy coffee, she could see that Jonathan was deeply uncomfortable. It hung off him like a heavy coat in summer. From her seat in the corner, Joni watched him sip from the huge, unwieldy bowl of a cup. She watched him gingerly turn it around in its saucer as though it were a new and hostile territory whose perimeters he must examine. She watched him sniff suspiciously at the cinnamon shaker before guiltily tipping some over his drink. She watched him paw fastidiously at his upper lip, wiping away a phantom foam moustache every few minutes. It was like a pantomime, each expression magnified to the point of parody. He looked around feverishly, as though he was being secretly filmed, as though the whole thing were a honey trap, and a net might descend on him at any moment, hoisting him up red-handed for all the respectable heteronormative coffee drinkers to see. As soon as he finished his latte, his face said, he would hunt down the Nancy responsible for this unmanly act of deliciousness and give them a piece of his mind. As soon as he finished his latte. Joni didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Men, they put so much time and energy into this kind of performance, but then they did everything they could to make the effort seem natural and easy. They were like swans above water, or Michael Flatley above the waist. It seemed to her that men, most men, certainly not the man at the table next to Jonathan's, who had quite happily asked for a shot of caramel on top of his coffee, and could they give him a napkin, and did they have some sprinkles behind the counter? It seemed as if most men spent their entire lives guarding and grooming their masculinity the way a princess in a fairy tale might brush her hair 1,000 times before bed. What kind of life was that, to be constantly guarding something so fragile? How could you live life while you were hunched over a chrysalis? She never could do that, she mused, as she took another swig of her mint tea. She wanted to stand up. She wanted to walk around. She wanted to duck under the table and hide. 3 students came in with a lunchtime rush, the ends of their college scarves flying heroically in the wind. She only knew the first 2 men by sight, but the third was unmistakable. It was none other than Cliff Harper, he of the trapped wind, he of the gonorrhea, he of the chlamydia, he of the allergy to latex, and polyisoprene, and hands. From her vantage point in the corner, Joni scowled silently. The men in their scarves loitered smugly by the door, chuckling to themselves about something, she couldn't hear what. They were probably laughing at maths, she thought, or telling each other riddles in Elvish. Once again, Joni found herself wondering why she had ever got involved with a man who could process neither carbohydrates nor social cues. Was she being punished? Was there no other cafe in the city? The mere memory of that benighted evening was bad enough, but now he and his friends and their scarves were here in her cafe waiting for a free seat. It was only a matter of time before one of them spotted her. Why were they even here? She couldn't leave without bumping into Cliff, but if she stayed, she would be thrown mercilessly to the Christians. What to do? She didn't have time to make up her mind. Before she could move, a man was walking purposefully towards her. Not a mathematician, though. Even without the cross around his neck, she would have known he was one of them. Even before she read the back of the postcard, she could tell what was on it from the way he gave it to her, as though he were handing it to her in spite of some unspoken protest. Excuse me, can I give you this? On one side, there was a faded photograph of King's College Chapel taken from the rear, the River Cam running calmly behind it and a swallow frozen in flight, a single sign of summer and happier times to come. On the back was a quote in polite, careful handwriting. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of the Pleiades, or loose the bounds of Orion? Excuse me, he repeated. I've seen this, said Joni. Yes, it's from the Bible, he said. Yes, I know, that's where I've seen it, she said. Bible bashers. They always assumed that because she didn't carry visible evidence of belief in God, she must be stupid or depraved. One fortnight last summer, she had read Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Job. Her mother had accused her of trying to avoid tidying her room, but it was really nothing quite so willful. It was more like skepticism with a dash of curiosity. She'd seen God written about, heard him spoken about and spoken for. She'd heard him praised, scorned, rejected, interrogated, but she'd never seen him for herself. That summer, in a very small, densely printed text, she had wanted simply to see God, and she had seen him the way he usually is seen, through slightly narrowed eyes. While she was thinking about this, it all passed in a few seconds, the man's handsomeness crept up on her like a sly salesman. He was tall, had perfectly smooth skin and the build of a swimmer. True, he had a certain severity in the natural set of his features, which made him seem rather forbidding at first. But when Joni told him that she had read the quotation before, he smiled so warmly that something made her want to talk to him more, to explore him. And he, her, the smell of her hair, the dents in her fingers from writing essays, which she hadn't had to do since school, her soft, full lips when she spoke. Out of the corner of her eye, Joni saw Cliff and his friends resign themselves to sitting down reluctantly on the same table as the man with the phantom latte moustache. This was an interesting development, she realised. She decided that since Cliff was squarely in her line of sight, she might as well enjoy herself. I've read this before, she said, quickly, afraid that the handsome man might take the postcard back and move on to someone else. But he seemed more interested in her than before. Are you already a churchgoer? He said. It was an oddly specific question. He had done this before. If he had asked her whether she was a Christian, she could have said no, daring him to ask the source of her mysterious biblical knowledge. She could have relished the secret of her literary curiosity like a hidden superpower. Instead, he had asked her whether she went to church. He had raised the bar and dared her to leap over it. No, she said. Lapsed? I wasn't raised as a Christian or anything. Morris cocked his head and smiled. I'm rather curious, I suppose, she said. Yes, you are. Presumptuous. But with such a lovely smile, perhaps his presumption was correct. And how much had Cliff seen? Joni's eyes flicked involuntarily back to him. He was still there, still chuckling with his friends. But whereas before they had been ignoring the man at the table, now they were laughing at him. At first, she couldn't quite hear what was being said, but then she heard the word woofter and knew something was wrong. Morris followed her eyes to where Jonathan sat. He was besieged by mathematicians. Morris could see that trouble was brewing, but, well, Jonathan probably earned it. You shall not lie with a male, drawled an incredulous, militantly atheist and now very loud Cliff. The words themselves are barely audible above the nasal whine of his boarding school vowels. Why are you telling me that? It's the word of God, said Jonathan, flicking at his upper lip again, suddenly conscious of the fact that the cinnamon from his coffee might be sitting accusatorily beneath his nose, mixed with the foam, and that the mixture was brown. Yes, said Cliff, but didn't he say anything else? Do you people have to keep banging the bum drum? I just think that, and why do you keep fussing with your upper lip? Have you got some kind of twitch? You a pervert? I am not a pervert. Bloody Christians, drawled Cliff's friend, Artie, in a confident plush tenor. Artie knew the story of Cliff and Joni, how Joni had tricked Cliff into bed before ravishing him for hours, draining him of at least 2 bodily fluids and giving him 3 STIs, how he loathed her, how he hated her, how he wanted to tie her to his bedpost with one of her stupid linen scarves and... Cliff nodded sharply. He had noticed Morris when they came in, had noticed him talking to Joni now, and the way she looked at him, and was eyeballing the two of them as he spoke. Why do you always have to make everything about sex? And bumming? Perverts, the lot of you. Bloody put me off my hash browns. How come? Said the other friend. Fancy a sausage now, do you? Shut up, Beefy, said the first friend to the second. Oh, come on, Artie. You know you like it up the arse of a Tuesday afternoon. Cheer up. Maybe Latte Boy can sort you out. Just give him a minute to wipe off his last poo moustache. Jonathan, mortified, was powerless as the 3 of them descended into guffaws, nudging each other and grinning and saying some very unkind things about hot milk. He desperately wanted to wipe his mouth and walk away, but if they saw him leave, it would be tantamount to an admission of guilt. He was trapped. Shouldn't you do something? Said Joni. She wasn't particularly fond of either Christians or mathematicians, but she was inclined to think that at least most of the Christians had met a few women before deciding they were worthless. I think he needs to learn, said Morris. Learn what? At exactly that moment, Joni saw another of the Christians, a tall man with large arms and a determined expression, step into the fray. It was the man from the next table, the one who'd asked for sprinkles. I think you ought to leave him alone, said Alistair. Who are you? Said Cliff, hurling the challenge at him. His boyfriend. Having made a dramatic entrance, Alistair paused to review the situation into which he'd entered and to consider his options. He could pretend to be Jonathan's boyfriend, but that was probably a dead end, as Jonathan would never corroborate the story. He could suggest that he would like to be Jonathan's boyfriend, thus shifting the focus from Cliff and hopefully giving Jonathan time to regroup. But that, too, was problematic on many levels. He could opt to ignore Cliff's question and defend Jonathan dispassionately on moral grounds. This was probably the most pragmatic course of action, but defending Jonathan Tucker on moral grounds was a task, he knew, of Herculean proportions. Still. Alistair folded his considerable arms across his chest. Yes. Jonathan, down but not quite out, hung his mouth open in horror as Alistair took the situation into his own rough, muscular hands. And I don't like the way you're talking to him, said Alistair. Oh, said Beefy, we know what you like. Beefy looked at Alistair. Alistair looked at Beefy. Now it was personal. Now it wasn't only about Jonathan, who in this moment was just a stuck-up closet case with a peachy arse. Now it was about Alistair standing his ground. Joni's heart went out to him, the brave man who'd asked for sprinkles. She wanted to shame Cliff, to stand up and denounce him as the willful disseminator of lies and venereal diseases that she knew him to be. Alistair planted his feet and placed his hand firmly on the back of Jonathan's chair. You like him, don't you? Sneered Cliff. He had the air of a little boy who'd found a newt in the school pond and brought it into the playground to dangle in front of the girls. It wasn't his own disgust he was interested in. He wanted Alistair's. He wanted to shame him publicly for wanting this man. But Alistair would not be shamed. It was like the showdown scene in a western. Time stood still. All eyes turned to the two men and a wave of anticipation rolled out across the room. A woman froze while feeding the soup of the day to her infant son, and perhaps sensing the onset of a rather fruity monologue, she covered his ears. A newly trained barista hovered close by, holding a ginseng and vanilla infusion that quivered noisily in its saucer. Joel sat back smugly in his seat, thinking that none of this would have happened if they'd just used that poem about the cat. Meanwhile, in the corner, Joni and Morris, trapped, innocent by disassociation, God and desire naked before them. He's all right, said Alistair. He's all right, said Cliff, sarcastically gesturing towards Jonathan with both hands. What does that mean? Beefy snorted, but Alistair was still trying to decide, and Jonathan was looking at Alistair desperately. What? When Alistair kissed him. It was only for a moment, but for Jonathan it was long enough for everything about him, everything he had built up, to unravel. He had never kissed anyone before, never even dared to admit that he'd want to, or to admit that he'd wanted to kiss Alistair from the first time they'd met in the Bible study group, when Alistair walked in and seated himself casually, heavily, next to him and smiled. He'd used every ounce of his strength to suppress it, and in a moment his strength was entirely laid waste. Jonathan knew what Alistair was like. He could tell Alistair only wanted to sleep with him, and he was well aware that this might be a pretext. But in the long moment of being kissed for the first time, it didn't matter to him. It was like a summons, as though he were being called upon to act. Was this the call? Did the prophet Jeremiah feel his whole body seize up and relax when God called him? Did Jonah? Did they fear that the voice calling to them in the darkness was an evil spirit leading them to harm? Or worse, that it really might be him, after all, a God as irresistible as love? Distantly, he heard Cliff speak. Come on, he said, we're going to choir practice. It was with the discomfort of someone who has found more than he set out to find that Cliff stood up. What? Said Art. Let's go, before the whole bloody gay mafia gets here. After a moment, Beefy followed with Art in tow, frowning at the anticlimax. Cliff scowled at Joni before he left. Time unfroze. The lady with the soup of the day allowed herself to exhale. Her baby son clapped uproariously. The vanilla ginseng infusion landed safely on the table, and Alistair handed Jonathan a napkin. What the hell is wrong with you? Said Jonathan, shaking his head. The same thing that's wrong with you, I suppose, said Alistair. Jonathan looked at him so hungrily, it made him start. Would you like to have coffee? Said Morris. Somewhere else, said Joni. Yes. Yes. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oki, and thank you to all our speakers. And while we're waiting for audience questions, I thought I'd just kind of leap in with a few questions for OK to keep things going a bit. And I'm so glad that you chose to read the beginning of the novel, because there's just so much more to come afterwards. And most of the characters we haven't even met yet. We're still to meet them later on. One of those, of course, is Nnenna Maloney, who is the title character. And I wanted to ask you a bit about her, especially because you haven't mentioned her yet. And I suppose one thing I was wondering about was, I feel like I know a lot about her private thoughts. I know about her learning. She tries to learn languages on her own. We see her learning and reading in her bedroom. She thinks about her city. She thinks about her relationships with her parents, with her friends. She wonders who her father is. But I can't remember recognizing her joy. So I wondered about the title of her private joys, where they might be found, and what place joy has in the text in general.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Such a thoughtful reading of the text. Yeah, it is of the text. It's a book I wrote. Yeah. So the word joy was used kind of tongue in cheek in the title. It really largely refers to Nnenna's anxiety and her sort of anxiety daydreams, which, if you read the book, you'll see they're kind of dotted throughout the narrative for anybody who hasn't read it. Nnenna she suffers from anxiety, partly to do with the racism that she's experienced and the fact that nobody's ever really been able to talk to her about it because she's never met her dad and she's 17 years old. She's about to turn 17. And partly just because that's the way her brain works. And she will catastrophize, but in a way that means that she really has the experiences these kind of extended daydreams where she warps reality according to her anxiety. And there's and I wanted to kind of to show what that's like in an honest way, but also to be playful with it. And so there's I've tried to use a lot of humor in those episodes where Nnenna is reimagining what people are thinking behind her back, or the ways that people might talk about her as a young black woman when she's not around.
Thank you. And thinking about her as a character, she's quite similar to Zadie Smith's White Teeth, the main character in that novel. And I think your novel has been compared to that novel a few times. And of course, there are lots of similarities. They're both multi-generational stories. They deal with finding family histories. They are about multicultural, multiracial groups of friends, friendships, romances. I wondered what you think of that comparison when you receive it, and also whether you could just talk about perhaps whether Zadie Smith did influence your writing, or any other writers who you feel have been a stronger influence on your work.
That's thank you so much. I mean, I adore White Teeth. I read it when I was about not that much older than Nnenna, and it was such a brilliant novel in and of itself. I think it's so funny and brilliantly put together and so smart. And it really made me think. It really sort of opened my eyes, I guess, to A, the fact that multicultural Britain is something that you can write about, and B, that you can write about your own experiences as a black person in Britain, in fiction, in whatever way you want to. Zadie Smith is doing these brilliant things with this sort of tradition of British humour that, you know, comes through like Nick Hornby, and we see also in like David Nichols, who also inspired me very, very much. And it was such a permission moment for me to read White Teeth, to know that you could write about Black British life, which is something I really, really want to do, and I'm doing now in my second novel. And so to be compared to Zadie Smith in any way is hugely sort of humbling and incredibly nice to hear. So thank you very much for mentioning that. And I have such a huge admiration for that book. Other writers that have inspired me, gosh, there's so many. Whenever I answer this question, I always end up sort of talking about a different set of writers, because I always remember some people have inspired me and then forgot others. But David Nichols, definitely, with his novel One Day, I loved the sense of humour in that and the tenderness of it. There's so many to name. Muriel Spark is a big inspiration of mine. I think she's so funny, and she's very, and she has this really mischievous sense of humour that allows her to observe lots of very different types of people very, very efficiently in her writing. She can seem like she's almost being objective and non-judgmental, when actually she's being quite sharp and quite barbed in her comments. She's brilliant. There's a book called I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith, which who, if anybody doesn't know it already, she also wrote 101 Dalmatians. She was a brilliant writer, and that really inspired me a lot, because it really showed this very tender wise, knowing look into what it's like to be a teenager. The protagonist in I Capture the Castle is about Nnenna's age, actually. And I definitely thought a lot about Cassandra, the protagonist, when I was writing Nnenna and thinking about how to sort of portray that age. And gosh, there are too many others to name, but I think those would be 3 of the headlines.
I suppose the other thing that really strikes me about your novel is that it's not based in London. So as you mentioned, you felt that White Teeth gave you permission to write about Black British experience, but many of the novels written by Black writers in Britain are very London centric, especially the older ones, and it's more difficult for, especially for the public, to find novels that are written based in other cities or in rural locations. And I think what strikes me about your novel is its Manchester and Cambridge locations. And I wondered if you could talk about how you wrote those cities. So what it is that you, I don't know, your process, so how you actually conveyed those cities on the page, or perhaps what it was that you wanted to tell people about Manchester and about Cambridge, perhaps people who hadn't visited those cities before.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really wanted to write about those two because I know those two cities the best, I guess. Manchester is where I was born and raised, and it's where I still live now, and Cambridge is where I studied. So although none of the characters are based on me or anybody else, that I knew I could use my knowledge of place to inform the writing, and I was really glad I could do that because I think they're just two really interesting cities to live in and to go to. I love them both, but they're very different. They're very, very different. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and that they're both quite magical places, but the magic works differently in the different places. Manchester, it has, Cambridge is this very rarefied place which has a beauty that is very difficult to find elsewhere. But at the same time, it was a huge shock for me coming to Cambridge from having lived in Manchester until I was 18, because Manchester, I grew up in a really diverse part of Manchester. I had friends from like every major world religion by the time I was 9, and I thought that was normal. And then I went to Cambridge and I realized that wasn't normal, that there were lots of people who'd, even grown up in certain parts of London who just had never encountered diversity in the same way that I had. And it was the first time I'd ever felt like that, really. Before then, I'd only ever really been to Manchester and like a couple of times to Nigeria. So I'd never experienced my own Blackness in that way, in that kind of way where it was being looked at in the same way and to the same degree as it was in that very, very different place. So it was really something that I guess I was grappling with for a while I was thinking through the ideas that became this novel. And whereas in Manchester, there's it is diverse and it has this wonderful vibrancy to it, but it also has problems of its own. Manchester has problems like any city of inequality and unfairness and racism. When Nnenna experiences racism, she's in Manchester when she experiences it. Exposure to diversity does not guarantee education about it or sensitivity about it. And so I wanted to write about the kind of the highs and lows of that, and to be honest about it. As much as this is like a love letter really to both of those cities, I wanted to be honest about the things that the sort of the highs and the lows.
Thank you. Maybe we can ask Panya and Lauren to rejoin us, and we can ask some questions to all three of you. And I wondered perhaps if you could talk about this last year. You might have been asked lots of times to talk about this last year. Lauren, of course, your piece of writing was clearly inspired by the lockdown and the events of this last year. But I wondered if all of you could talk about the impact on your writing and also your kind of public performance and public engagement work, whether you kind of relished the opportunity for quiet time to write in your own space or tolerated it, and whether you are enjoying this opportunity to have online events where you can meet and speak to audiences without having to get on trains in the rain and buses and try and find your way to strange campuses, or whether it's something that you are looking forward to finishing. So it'd be great to hear from all three of you about that.
Lauren, do you want to go?
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, personally, last year I was a first year student, so navigating Nottingham was rather difficult. It's a lot easier here getting access to events. I think being in lockdown, it's stopped some of my inspiration, because I did, for one of my pieces last year, a mini collection featuring lockdown, and the first one, my piece I read today, inspired by lockdown, was written during the second sort of national shutdown in a way, also known as the global lockdown in November. And then I'm currently working on a digital version where I'm slowly publishing parts of it on Instagram with some illustrations I'm working on. Yeah, so a lot of my work recently has been inspired by the lockdown, because it's such a different thing that I've never experienced before. But I have enjoyed having more time, not having to worry about finding places when going to events and things. So it has been useful, but there have been difficulties, of course, with internet and everything, and not being able to see friends and family, but getting on as best as I can.
Yeah, so lockdown, I've actually, on one level, really thrived in lockdown, in that it's made me focus on my research. I mean, the only downside I can think of in terms of my research is that because the predominant group that I interview are elderly people, they're not necessarily tech savvy. So I haven't been able to do like Zoom interviews with them. It's been by telephone, and then recording sound on telephone isn't that great. But that aside, other than that, it's really given me time to reflect, connect again with nature, decide on the things that I want to do and the things that I don't want to do. It's made me scale back so much of the noise that was in my life. And, you know, I've become an essentialist. You know, I've learned through this period to be able to say, no, I'm not taking on that commission, or I'm not doing that work, because actually I value my peace of mind and my personal health more. So it's been really great on that level. Of course, it's terrible in the sense that it's a pandemic and people have lost their lives. I've been fortunate that no one close to me has lost their life, so I've been fortunate in that sense. But yeah, I think it's been a really positive time, and I hope, you know, we as a nation really use this time to reflect on what life is and the meaning of life, and to slow the pace and to be still, and to kind of prioritize what is important and what isn't. So yeah, it's been good for me.
Yeah, I completely, I can really relate to that, definitely. I think, so, especially at first, when lockdown first started, I was like, oh my goodness, I have a bit more time to, well, a lot more time to read things. I have more time to write, and this is fantastic. And, you know, this is what I've always wanted. And that remains true to a certain extent. But I think also I've realized even more that I really rely on being able to socialize and see my friends and go out and just have sort of do spontaneous things as a way of distracting me from the less fun parts of writing. I love writing so much, and when it's going well, there's no other feeling like it in the world, but that also it can be a very difficult emotional process. And so it's really nice to be able to see your friends and just to do things that you like, that keep you cheerful. So I do miss that. And I've been writing this second book through lockdown, and I'm editing it now, and I'm really happy with what I've done. But I think that I can see, as I'm looking at it again, that this is definitely, even though it's definitely not a book about lockdown, it's definitely a book that has been influenced by lockdown, and the way that some of the narratives, I think, are very much about some of the things that we have all experienced during the pandemic.
Thank you. One of the questions from the audience seems to follow on quite nicely from that comment, okay, about the more difficult aspects of writing. We've had a question asking all three of you about your editing processes. I don't know whether editing is one of those painful moments, maybe editing is one of the nicer moments, but I wondered if all three of you could answer that question about your editing processes.
With mine, it's part of my course. I'm quite lucky to be very close with my creative writing cohort, so I'll happily just send over some work to them and they'll give me the feedback, or I can send it to my tutor. I really quite enjoy editing because it polishes my work. Like even today I was practicing through my piece and I was editing it at the same time because I thought it was finished when I first sent it off, and I clearly thought otherwise after leaving it to rest for a while. I try to make sure I plan in when I want to edit, so sometimes I'll edit my own work, and as I said, I'll send it over to my cohort. My usual days for editing tend to be a Wednesday, and I tend to write over the weekend. It gives me a nice break. So yeah.
Editing. Well, unfortunately, I wasn't fortunate enough to do an MA in creative writing because I was denied that opportunity. So I had to learn intuitively how to edit my work in the first instance. And the way I did that was really just about saying it out and listening to it and trying to remove any of the extraneous words that didn't need to be there. I guess as part of the PhD, I do have that support where I can sit down and I can talk about my work with my supervisors. But before presenting it to my supervisors, I do try to pare it back as much as possible and to make sure that the focus of what I'm saying is really sharp. And then there's all those kind of things, you know, tautology, etc., that you try to ensure that's not in your work and that you're showing, you know, and not telling and all of those kind of things. So really just trying to sharpen it as much as I can. But I will say, actually, which is, I guess, a little bit similar to what OK said, is that I would normally go and edit my work sitting in a cafe. And I have missed that, because that's a just completely different environment from the home environment, and it kind of works for me. So that is something I have missed, going and sitting with a cup of coffee, and I can actually just block out the noise of the other people in the cafe and just really hone in on my work in a different environment. So I've had to learn to do that at home in the same environment. It has been a little bit different. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I can really relate to that as well, Panya. Yeah, editing is, yeah, it's funny you said that, Jenny. Is editing like a joy, or is it a difficult part of the process? I think it's, for me personally, it's a bit of both, or a lot of both. It is, you know, it's the part, like Panya and Lauren have both said, where you refine your work and you start to see it make progress, but also because of that, you're kind of very aware of, oh my goodness, did I really say that? Did I, you know, you can often, when you leave your work for a while to breathe, as I think you should do before editing, you kind of develop an idea of what you think the work is that is not necessarily exactly how you left it. And so it can be really a bit of a, oh wow, did I really write that way at first? But then I think that's quite nice. It's I think developing that sense of yourself almost as a reader rather than as a writer is a really, really good thing and a really nice thing that I enjoy.
And that's a lovely moment to come back to probably our final question for the evening, which is going to be a bit of a strange double question. So, okay, we've already talked about your literary influences. So one of the audience members has asked about Panya's and Lauren's literary influences. So if Panya and Lauren could answer that question, and then maybe, okay, if you could tell us something, if you can, about your second novel, if you're able to, that would be great. And then we'll hand back to Rory. Thank you.
My literary influences are broad and many, actually. It seems a bit unfair to kind of name any one particular person. I guess as I'm beginning to reflect on my own writing journey, I'm looking at the people who influenced me from as early as I can remember. So one of the first poetry books that I read at the age of 10 was by Louise Bennett, and it was her Jamaica Labrish. And it was actually her collection. It was the first poem, Colonizing in Reverse, was the first poem I actually ever memorized. And that influenced me in the sense that it made me, I liked the sound of the words in my mouth, and I liked the way speaking it. And it kind of made me feel like I could actually perform, even though I didn't realize it, because I memorized it and I would recite it to anybody who would listen. So that's from the early age of 10. And then there's people like Jean Binta-Breeze, who I remember seeing her. She came on TV at an ungodly time of the morning. One night I was watching TV, I'm a mom, I've got 4 kids, so I had like a young baby that wouldn't sleep, so I was up watching the TV, and Jean Binta-Breeze came on reciting Ridden Ravings, the Mad Woman's poem, and it just resonated with me. And it kind of made me feel perhaps I could embark upon this journey of being a performance poet. So women like that have really influenced and inspired me to kind of take up performance poetry, to do dub poetry, and so on. But I'll stop there because I could go on forever.
I'd say with my work, one of the earliest writers that I read would be Maggie Stiviato. Her trilogy Shivalinga Forever, and then a few years later she released the 4th one, Sinner. I distinctly remember reading them because me and my childhood friend, we did like a reading competition to see who could finish it first, and that was probably the first influence on my reading, and then it just sort of grew. Most recently I'd say Holly Bourne, and within her talks about feminism and mental health, specifically the Normal series. A lot of poetry I tend to link back to Carol Ann Duffy, just because I love her work on like women, and at A-levels I read her collection, The Feminine Gospels, and over the course of last year I read majority of her collection, The Bees. Although when I was doing some research for one of my modules last year, I read The Poet X. The name of the author escapes me, but I loved how poetry was used to tell a narrative, because I've only ever seen poetry to be singularly, and being able to see different types of poems and different forms and structures, just being able to tell an entire like story narrative. I consumed that book within about 10 hours. I didn't put it down other than for the basics of getting food. And it's taken a lot of influence in the poem I'm working on at the minute, trying to tell a year in the life of lockdown from March 23rd, 2020 till present. And I'd say that's probably my strongest influence at the minute.
Oh, so many great names there. Yeah, so to talk about my second book. So I think I can talk about it now. It's going to be out in just under a year, on the 10th of March next year. It's called Here Again Now. It is a novel inspired by the biblical book of Ruth, which is, for those of you who don't know it, it's about essentially 2 women who are technically not family, but who choose to stick together and help each other. In the Bible, they literally help each other to survive and find food. And I've always loved that story. And I wanted to think about what it was that that binds those two together. And so I've transposed that story from out of the sort of the Hebrew world with two women to the Black British world with two men, and to think about queerness and what family really means. And then so it's a story of sort of, I guess, investigating what it is that combined people together and what boxes them off from each other. So I've really, really enjoyed writing it, and I'm so excited for people to read it next year.
I'm really excited to read it, and if only we had more time, I wanted to ask you about your use of the Bible and as a text, and also religion in Nnenna Maloney, but now I want to know about it in this book too. And I also wanted to ask you about masculinity and the way you conveyed masculinity as a kind of performance, which I think I've hardly ever seen before. Of course, we all know about femininity as a performance, but it's so interesting and new to see masculinity as a performance. So instead of asking you loads more questions, I'll just encourage everybody to go and read the book if they haven't done already, and of course to make sure they get hold of your new book when it's published. And thank you all so much for such a wonderful evening of reading. Thank you so much, Lauren Morey, Panya Banjoko and Okechukwu Nzelu. And I will hand back to Rory now, who would like to tell everybody something more about the Creative Writing Hub. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, he would. Yes, thank you, OK, Panya, Lauren, and of course, Jenny, fabulous chair. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Please go to the Nottingham Creative Writing Hub at NTU website, which is www.nottinghamcreativewritinghub.com, to check out our other activities. Panya Banjoko, for example, has a profile on the website and has contributed to a blog post interview. There are also links to recordings of some of this year's events on the website, and soon there will be links to recordings of more of our past events. So keep an eye out for that over the spring. Flowers and blossom and bees and birds will appear, and so will recordings of our events, so the joys of spring. We're nearly at the end of this academic year's programme of events, but there's one more on the 31st of March, so a week today, I believe. That is right, isn't it? Yeah, a week today. That event is in collaboration with NTU's WRAP programme, WRAP. And Becky Cullen is chairing a reading and conversation with Ashley Hickson-Lovance, who's reading with NTU BA Creative Writing student John Lewell. WRAP stands for Writing, Reading and Pleasure. There will be plenty of reading and pleasure on the night, I assure you, and hopefully some inspiration for writing too. And you can find a booking link to that on the Nottingham Creative Writing Hub website. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Thank you for coming and enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.